Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. On this little bonus episode, I am diving into one of my favorite subjects, the early Cold War. And if you haven't guessed, we are talking about the bomb, the atomic age. That golden era of the early 1950s where everything was going to be atomic, the future was going to be nuclear, and all we had to do was not blow ourselves up in the process. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's naturally start at the beginning. So on July 16th, 1945 at 5:29 and 21 seconds a.m., the world would change forever because that was the detonation of a little device known as the Gadget. And the Gadget was an implosion-designed plutonium bomb, the world's first nuclear weapon to be detonated. This test would later be known as the Trinity test, and it would be the one that launched us into the nuclear age. This was a turning point in history. Man had cracked the secrets of the atom. And then post-World War II, when the secret was out, we were launched into a little-known era of the late 40s throughout the 50s known as the atomic age. Now, to be honest, we are still living in the atomic age. It has been going on since 1945, but there's kind of a little cultural subsect of this age that existed throughout the early 50s that really grabbed the attention of Americans back then. It was this almost retro-futuristic idea that the world, the future was going to be nuclear. Everything was going to run on nuclear power. The coal plants were going to be replaced by nuclear power plants. Your car was going to run on like nuclear fission. Everything from your watch to your television to your coffee maker, it was all going to be nuclear. However, at the same time, there is this existential dread because we're locked in a little conflict with the Soviet Union known as the Cold War. And when the Soviets developed the bomb in 1949, that cranks the tension up to 11 because now there's that existential dread of total nuclear annihilation. And to some extent, that fear really exists in the back of our minds to this day. But that existential dread doesn't stop us from still enjoying all the great things that nuclear energy could give us. And in the 1950s, the future was coming alive before our very eyes because it led to this futuristic outlook on the world, and it affected art and architecture and furniture. And even better, it got kids interested in the sciences. It eventually led to things like the development of NASA and so on and so forth. And it created this really cool aesthetic that kind of belongs to the 50s and even into the very early 60s. And the perfect example of this aesthetic would be seen in Las Vegas in the 50s. It really capitalized on this. I mean, Las Vegas at the time was known as the Atomic City, and that's simply because it wasn't far from the Nevada test range. And throughout the 1950s up into the early 60s before the above-ground nuclear test ban treaty, the US military was out there setting off nukes for anybody to see. And these explosions could be seen in Las Vegas. And it led to this phenomenon known as nuclear tourism, and it was a real boon for Las Vegas during these early days because remember, up until the 40s, Las Vegas is really kind of a backwater. It's not the gambling mecca it is today. So they decide that, these nuclear tests are happening, outside the city, and we can see them in the city. Let's capitalize on this. And these tests happen so frequently that the guys in the casinos, they would literally have schedules of nuclear tests and they would plan these nuclear watch parties. And basically, you can just go into this really swanky retro-futuristic lounge, order yourself an atomic cocktail, which is a real drink, and hang out and party, and the crescendo of the party is that iconic mushroom cloud from a nuclear test blast. And part of it was propaganda. It was the showcase to the everyday American that, look what we can do. We have the bomb. Don't fuck with America. But it wasn't all bombs and cocktail lounges, even though that's kind of my favorite part of it. I would have loved to have been there in the Sky Lounge at the Desert Inn, sipping on an atomic cocktail, watching a nuclear explosion in the background. I can't imagine something more like freaking awesome than that. But I'm a guy, we like explosions, so obviously I would love something like that. But there was this optimistic idea amongst the populace of just what nuclear energy could do. It was believed at the time that nuclear energy could render fossil fuels completely obsolete. There was all this research being launched in how nuclear energy could be used, from irradiating food to desalinating water, and there was the earliest research into nuclear medicine. They believe that it would be the solution to what kicks off the space age. Nuclear energy would get our spaceships to the moon and to Mars, and there was this belief that nuclear electricity would become so available and so cheap that it wouldn't even be worth to measure usage, and your electricity bill would disappear. These people really envisioned a utopian society, but somehow anti-communist at the same time. Sorry, communists, but you all aren't allowed in retro-futuristic 50s American utopia. But unfortunately, it wasn't long until this kind of golden age fantasy era came to an end. Now, everybody has known since the time of Madame Curie that radiation is dangerous and not something to be messed with. And what is extremely radioactive? Nuclear waste, along with nuclear fallout from these above ground tests. And people living downwind of these tests started to realize rises in cancer rates and other symptoms of basically radiation sickness. Eventually, nuclear energy and all this stuff starts to fall out of favor. Part of it's because of costs, part of it is because of various incidents that were happening. They started realizing that water was becoming contaminated due to nuclear fallout. They were starting to see three-eyed fish everywhere. You know, Mr. Burns wasn't really helping matters much because he was just dumping his nuclear waste in a park. And that brings up those age-old questions. Well, what do you do with the nuclear waste? You can keep them in these containment pools. You have to bury them out in the desert where they're still radioactive for thousands of years. And then anything nuclear after that kind of left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, especially considering you still have the existential threat of nuclear weapons. And also that existential threat of, well, what if that nuclear power plant goes critical, releases all this radiation, then eventually we have a Chernobyl incident. So it is fair to say that by the early 60s, the idealistic nuclear age was at an end, and it led us back into that darker age of what we are still in today, where we go back to those old threats of mutual assured destruction, and we still have those saber rattlers today. You know, these heads of state, they're like, we're gonna launch nukes on Moscow, and we're gonna launch nukes on Paris, or we're gonna launch nukes on Washington, D.C., or whatever. And it's like, shut the fuck up. Nobody's gonna launch a nuke at anybody. But that threat of nuclear annihilation does bring up another topic. It's kind of a conspiracy theory that's been going around for the last several months. And it's this idea that during those nuclear tests in the 50s, that we actually faked those. And people will come up with various reasons as to why we faked them. Some will say, well, we didn't have the resources to build that many nuclear weapons at the time, or we didn't really want to set off a bunch of nukes in the desert and irradiate people. And I guess coyotes and stuff, which just randomly made me think, how many mutated critters are out there in the deserts around Las Vegas that are living up in the hills? Maybe there's some Godzilla type creature living in a cave somewhere and it feeds on lost hikers. I digress. But back to the conspiracy theory. It states that for whatever reason we faked those, that those houses and those little towns that you see in those famous depictions of these nuclear blasts were actually models on a table. So you set up a diorama, and they were just being blown apart with a controlled explosion that was aimed towards it. Because when you look at that video, especially that iconic one of the house exploding, it looks like a bunch of balsa wood kind of blowing up. And it said that the reason they were doing this and releasing this footage was basically to scare the hell out of the Soviets and to reinforce that idea of, look what we have, look what we're capable of, look what we can do, don't fuck with us. And the reason this all came up was because this guy on another podcast, a extremely famous podcast that I wish I just had a fraction of the audience of, asked the simple question, what happened to the cameras? How did they get that camera footage? How did the initial flash from the nuclear weapon, which can literally blind a human, not overwhelm the camera, how did it survive the heat and the strong winds, and why wasn't the film in the camera completely irradiated beyond use? And it's actually a question that's articulated very well in this discussion on that famous podcast that we all know about. And the clip has gone viral in the past few months, so if you're listening to this, you obviously have seen that clip. But that kind of like launches that conspiracy theory, because even when I first heard that, I was sitting there thinking, you son of a bitch. Because when I heard that, I too didn't know. I was like, wait, what? So it led to me doing the research, and then it led to this rabbit hole, which has become this little bonus episode. And what I gathered from when I was looking into this, apparently the cameras were like miles away, which, okay, that makes sense. The cameras are far enough away that they won't be affected by the nuclear blast. But what about radiation and fallout? Well, apparently these cameras were in these lead and like concrete boxes, and they were like super dark inside, and I guess they were aimed at mirrors, which were aimed at the actual blast, so it would kind of deviate that initial flash from ruining the film. And these concrete boxes with these cameras in them were like on these really high posts, which were like buried deep into the ground with like concrete, so they wouldn't shake in the high winds that would be generated, because a nuclear bomb can generate some like gale force winds. Not to be confused with the popular board game, for those who know what I'm talking about. You guys who get that joke are awesome. But yeah, apparently these cameras were like super secured. And they did admit that a lot of cameras in early tests were ruined because they simply really didn't know how to position them so they wouldn't be completely annihilated. Of course, once I read that, I guess I was somewhat satisfied. There's still that question that lingers in my mind of how they got those really great close-up shots. And I am a bit of a camera buff. I did do some archaeological photography back in the day. So it kind of amazes me that these cameras were able to get these great close-up shots in the 1950s, but maybe there's something about them that I haven't been able to find in my own research yet. Maybe they were using some kind of specialized telephoto lens. I don't know. But like I said, that question was kind of what led me down this rabbit hole, which led to me learning about this era in the 1950s, this aesthetic and this optimism around nuclear power.
Nuclear. It's pronounced nuclear.
And it was kind of a fun little rabbit hole to dive down, because I had no idea. I didn't know nuclear tourism was a thing. I thought it was just a trope from like a video game or something. But before I go, I would like to just discuss one last thing, this atomic cocktail. Apparently, it was a real drink and it was served all over Las Vegas. And it's not to be confused with that variation today that we see in the Fallout series. Those drinks have their own special blends and they're not really true to the original. Now, the earliest one I can find actually comes from cocktailsdistilled.com, and this recipe is as follows. 1.5 ounces of vodka, 1.5 ounces of cognac, half an ounce of Amontillado sherry, and top with a brut champagne. You pour the first 3 ingredients into a shaker and you shake it. You strain it into a chilled coupe and then you top it with champagne. And it's garnished with an orange zest twist. That is a classic 1950s atomic cocktail, and if I had those ingredients right now, I would totally have one because that sounds delicious. Sounds like it's very dangerous too. Maybe I'd only have one of those, 2 at the most. So there you go. At the very least, we all got an awesome cocktail recipe out of this episode. But on that note, I am going to end it here. This was more of a ramble than anything. I just really wanted to talk about this really awesome era in American history. It's one that really doesn't come up much, and I think it deserves a little bit of appreciation. Plus, we got a cool little conspiracy theory out of it. As always, if you like the episode, follow it on Spotify, give it those 5 stars. You can find it on the socials. It's Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram, at Threads. And if you really want to be awesome, you can go to that link in the description of every episode and kick me a few bucks. It really, truly does help the show out. You guys have no idea how much that helps. So once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.